We are here with our presenter for the evening. Audubon Everglades is excited to welcome Dr. Stephen Davis as our featured presenter this month. A native of Ohio, Dr. Davis began his educational journey at Georgetown University, where he majored in biology and environmental science. Then he attended Morehead State for his master's in aquatic ecology, and then on to Florida International University for his Ph.D. in mangrove ecology. Dr. Davis is an aquatic ecologist with 30 years of research experience in the coastal Everglades. After spending 10 years as a professor of wetland ecology at Texas A&M University, he has spent the last 15 years with the Everglades Foundation and is their current chief science officer and a key voice for the Everglades Foundation's mission to restore America's Everglades. Dr. Davis has also co-authored or authored more than 60 peer-reviewed scientific publications, and he holds a courtesy associate professorship position at Florida International University. To see his scientific publications, visit his Google Scholar page posted in the chat. Tonight, Dr. Davis will tell us about efforts underway to reverse the damage that humans have inflicted over the course of the last century upon Florida's Everglades, which is one of our planet's most complex, dynamic, and unique ecosystems. Please remember to put your questions or comments for Dr. Davis in the chat, and we will do our best to answer all of them after the presentation. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Steve Davis, presenting on Everglades Restoration Progress, Building Resilience. Steve, you can now share your screen and begin. I will stop sharing mine.
Thanks, Scott, and thank you and Sabina for the invitation to present to this group. It's been, seems like a decade or more since I last presented to Audubon of the Everglades. And that's a good thing because a lot has happened over that last decade. We've had a lot of Everglades restoration progress, and we're seeing signs of improvement across the system. As you mentioned, our mission at the Everglades Foundation is to see Everglades restoration through to completion. But the challenge doesn't stop there because we have issues that transcend the capacity of restoration to solve all of our issues. In fact, water quality is a major challenge that we're going to be wrestling with for decades to come. And the title of this presentation is really, it's not just restoring the Everglades, it's about how restoration begins to build resilience for South Florida. And the way that works is, first, you need to recognize that the harm to the Everglades ecosystem is what allowed us to develop much of South Florida. The drainage efforts, the network of canals and levees and water control structures that we have, that's what allowed South Florida to thrive and at the same time cause substantial harm to the Everglades ecosystem. But the Everglades Restoration Program, in large part through the addition of water storage, through additional water treatment and more modernized water control structures, it allows us to not only build ecosystem health and resilience in the Everglades, but also helps to build resilience throughout our communities, all the way to the shoreline and beyond, because improving the flows of water in the Everglades means that we're storing, we're treating that water, we're putting it where it needs to be. At the same time, we're recharging the aquifer that millions of us in the Lower East Coast depend upon for our water supply. And at the same time, allowing us to manage water at the coastline in a way that improves habitat for things like mangroves, seagrasses, and oysters. So this diagram here, it's a rather complicated diagram, but it just shows how all of these things are tied together. Now, it's important to recognize that restoration of the Everglades is not the panacea for all of our issues. We have issues related to climate change and sea level rise that will also be impacting us for decades to come. But restoration puts us in a better position to be able to continue to build resilience along our coastline through conversion of gravity flow structures to pump structures, elevation of properties in some areas, providing places for water to drain more naturally. All these things sort of depend upon us first completing Everglades restoration. And this is another sort of complicated set of animations, but it shows you on the left how the Everglades worked. And I think many of you understand how the Everglades worked. It was connected really from Orlando all the way down to Lake Okeechobee, and Lake Okeechobee was free to flow directly into the Everglades when it would fill up. And we know that river of grass would fan out. Water would also flow from the Everglades through those transverse glades and natural channels into our coastal waters from Lake Worth Lagoon all the way down Biscayne Bay and certainly down into Florida Bay. Well, our actions of damming, draining, polluting, reducing, disconnecting, and compartmentalizing the ecosystem has had pretty dire consequences in terms of increased algae, much of which is often toxic and toxin forming, lost habitat, loss of diversity, increased in invasive and exotic species, increased emissions of greenhouse gases. A good example of that is the Everglades agricultural area south of Lake Okeechobee, an area that used to be the Everglades. Because we've drained that area, those peat soils have been emitting millions of metric tons of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere each and every year, simply because they're kept in that drained state for agriculture. We've also seen economic harm because as Florida has developed, and many of you know this quite well, we are really not an agricultural-based economy. We're a tourism-based economy. That's why many of us enjoy the fact that we don't have a state income tax. Tourists come and provide that source of income to drive our state government, as well as real estate transactions. When you exchange or transact real estate, the documentary stamp tax, that's an important form of revenue to the state. And so these things that I'm describing that drive our economy today are all imperiled as a result of these changes in the flow and in the quality of water across the Everglades. Well, of course, we have Everglades restoration to help us deal with that. And I'll speak to that shortly. But this right here, this image that Ed Lippisch took earlier this year from his plane, and many of you may know Ed or Jackie Thurlow Lippisch, who served on the Water Management District Governing Board. They've really documented the impacts of lake discharges to the Stewart, Hutchinson Island, Jupiter Island communities. When those discharges from the lake occur, and they did earlier this year, as this image shows, taken February 25th of this year, you can see that plume of polluted, fresh water from Lake Okeechobee extending well offshore. And that was just after a few weeks of discharge. And we know the lasting harm that these discharges have on seagrasses, oysters, and of course, many of the species, including birds, that depend on these habitats. And so Everglades restoration was really designed, conceptualized to address these water quality and quantity problems. Got a few images of toxic blue-green algae, the impacts of red tide on the West Coast, expansion of cattail in the Everglades, and I'll speak to that in a minute. But also a lack of water getting down into places like Florida Bay at the tip of the peninsula that leads to seagrass die-offs during extreme drought. All of these issues are connected to the same fundamental problem in the way water was rerouted, replumbed, and polluted across South Florida. A lot of the blue-green algae and red tide issues are pretty well documented in the news, but you may not understand that phosphorus has a pretty significant impact on Everglades marsh habitat. And the two illustrations here on the bottom just show what a typical natural ridge and slough habitat would look like in the Everglades, and the very diverse assemblage of species that depend on that, including periphyton, very sensitive algae mat to increases in phosphorus. And as phosphorus levels ramp up to where it contaminates the soil, we get nothing but cattail. And in many areas of Water Conservation Area 2A, and certainly surrounding Area 1, Loxahatchee Refuge, you see these walls of cattail as a result of that long-lasting phosphorus pollution. And so the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, I know that many of you are aware of this, but just to bring up a few issues that are relevant to the presentation, this was a plan that was really designed to resolve those Central and Southern Florida project issues. That was the original drainage efforts across South Florida that established the Everglades agricultural area south of the lake. It carved out areas for those water conservation areas to exist, ensured that excess discharges would go to the east and west coast down the St. Lucie and Caloosahatchee estuaries. This plan was signed in 2000. We're in 2024, obviously. This was a 30-year plan. It was conceived to be built out over that time frame. Made great progress, but we still have a ways to go. It's important to note that politically, this comprehensive plan benefits from strong bipartisan support. This is one of the few issues to this day that you can get the most extreme right and left signing on to the same letters of support calling for restoration funding among the Florida delegation. And even nationally, we benefit from broad bipartisan support for this ecosystem restoration effort. And this image here just shows that. You see Bill Clinton signing the comprehensive plan into law. Got, of course, Bob Graham over here to the right, who unfortunately just passed recently. Jeb Bush, who was our governor at the time, of course, a Democratic president, Congressman Clay Shaw. And to Bill Clinton's right here is Mary Barley, who's one of our founding directors, and her husband was a co-founder of the organization. So that bipartisan support was important to getting this effort underway, and it's going to be essential to seeing it through. Everglades restoration, unlike many of these large-scale ecosystem restoration efforts nationwide, is a 50-50 cost share. In fact, many of these large ecosystem restoration programs, it is more like a 90-10 split where the federal government is on the hook for the bulk of the costs. In this state, it's a 50-50 partnership. So what we tell people from Iowa, not only is the Everglades a treasure, a national treasure that we need to protect for a variety of reasons, but it's also one of the few ecosystem restoration programs where the federal government is getting a 50% discount on this program because the state is carrying their load as well. You can see on this map a number of the projects around the ecosystem, around Lake Okeechobee, that are part of this plan or were assumed to be completed as this program advanced. And an example of that is the Kissimmee River Restoration Project that we just saw completion of about a year and a half ago. This program is also adaptive, and I'll speak to what I mean by that, but it has incorporated into it flexibility as new information is gained or as potentially land becomes available to make this program advance. Well, restoration at its core is about ensuring water supply for the lower East Coast and for the communities around the greater Everglades ecosystem. This just shows that if you're out enjoying the Everglades, it's important to know that water's not only on the surface, but it's actually extending down to the base of the aquifer. This ecosystem recharges the Biscayne aquifer that millions of us depend upon, from Key West all the way up to southern Palm Beach County. And so their water supply wells are all tapping into that Biscayne aquifer and directly conveying that water to users, whether agricultural or residential. Everglades restoration also ensures water or flood protection. And I love these Google Earth images just simply because of the stark contrast from one side to the other. So you go from Palm Beach County, where you've got vast sugar fields immediately adjacent to a water conservation area. And it's not even to speak to any of the impacts of agriculture here. Just maintaining that level of flood protection is a critical role of Everglades restoration and goes into the planning for every project. Another example, the areas near the Sawgrass Expressway in Broward County. You've got Water Conservation Area 2 immediately adjacent to that highway system, as well as those dense suburban communities in western Broward County. And then you go down into Miami-Dade. Many people may not know we have a lot of agriculture in South Miami-Dade County, but we've got Everglades National Park immediately adjacent to tree farms, winter vegetables, ornamental plant growers. And so again, maintaining that line between putting water in the natural system and trying to keep it out of these areas adjacent to them is a critical role. Back to that adaptive statement, and it's important again to note that this plan was passed in 2000. So we're 24 years in. We haven't just been going based on the original plan. That plan has been adapted based on new information. And I just have this first bullet here because for those of us that recall when the iPod came out in 2001, it was just a transformational technology. But we've completely abandoned that technology and moved on to things like iPhones, iPads, watches. So technology, just over this period of time since CERP was passed, has been just generations ahead. And likewise, our observations of the ecosystem, the disturbances across the Everglades, the addition of new infrastructure, which allows improved operations, not to mention the fact that we're generating new science every year, over 150 technical publications per year since 2000. That's moving science and the body of knowledge forward. New and improved technologies resulting from changes in our understanding of the ecosystem. And I'll speak to that a little bit as well. And then, of course, increased understanding of climate change and its impacts has also forced us to rethink the way that we plan these projects and the way we prioritize the various components in the restoration plan. And fortunately, the plan allows for that adaptability. We have a lot of projects that have been planned and authorized by Congress, and they're in what's called the integrated delivery schedule. And I know you cannot read this, but it's merely to show you there's a lot that's on the plate right now, that's underway, that's under construction, that's near completion. And these projects are in varying degrees of construction and operational testing. You can see across the top of this, you can actually Google integrated delivery schedule, and you'll get this table in much more detail, and you can see the detailed components of each of these projects and also the timeline for completing them across the top here in gray. And it's important to note that there's a dollar figure required in order for us to move from one column to the next. And that's the appropriations side of things. Just because we get the projects authorized by Congress doesn't mean that we can go out and build them. In fact, I'll give you an example. There's a project that's currently in planning now called the Biscayne Bay Southeastern Everglades Ecosystem Restoration Project. This is part of CERP. and it pulls a number of components together. It's been in planning for a few years. We had hoped to get authorization of this project in 2026. We're still not complete with planning that project, but assuming it stays on track, which many of us think it won't, then we have to go back to Congress every year for appropriations asks, not just for this project, but for all these others that are in the table and currently under construction. The point I'm trying to make here is that not only does it require the planning of these projects, but we have to go to Congress, get them authorized. We have to go back to Congress each and every year to get this bottom line figure fulfilled so that we can stay on schedule. And if we don't get, say, $1.48 billion next year from the federal government and the state combined, then project components get pushed forward in time. What that equates to is delay. And we've made great progress in getting us caught up on Everglades restoration, but it's one of these things that you can't let your foot off the gas pedal. You have to maintain that commitment to going to Tallahassee, going to Washington, D.C. every year to ensure that this funding is there. And this isn't my responsibility, but we have a policy team that is primarily responsible for doing this, both in Tallahassee and Washington, D.C., ensuring that the dollars are there. And they're really the unheralded champions in all of this. I mentioned earlier that the Kissimmee River Restoration Project is completed, and that's a huge accomplishment. And anywhere else in the world, the completion of this project would receive regional, national headlines because it was such a monumental undertaking, and it's taken decades to complete. But this is just one part of this larger Everglades restoration effort. The image on the left I took from a commercial flight. You can see that meandering channel moving across the floodplain. And in fact, back and forth across the canal that was dredged through the middle of that floodplain back in the 1960s. So we're seeing improved habitat, water quality, the ability to store water in that floodplain where we couldn't in the past. We've also seen completion recently of the repairs to the Herbert Hoover Dike. That added infrastructure allows us to operate Lake Okeechobee in a more equitable and beneficial way to South Floridians. Historically, the lake has been operated for the needs of agriculture, primarily sugar. But now we have a chance to manage the lake in a way to where we can reduce damaging discharges to the east and west coasts. We can allow the lake to get a little bit higher, which isn't great for lake condition, but we also need to solve the water quality problem for Lake Okeechobee if we're ever going to resolve that system. It also cuts discharges greatly to Lake Worth Lagoon, and that's important to note as well. And aligning with the goals and objectives of Everglades restoration, we can send much more water from the lake to the south than we were in the past, and especially during the dry season. That was a great example of how infrastructure and operations sort of work hand in hand. The real big daddy of them all is the EAA Reservoir south of Lake Okeechobee, the Everglades Agricultural Area Reservoir. This is, I referred to all the time as the heart bypass surgery for the Everglades. I showed you earlier that the Lake Okeechobee, and it's even referred to as the beating heart of the Everglades. Well, the beating heart is no longer connected to the body. The way we reconnect the heart back to the body is with this bypass surgery, by building this large reservoir south of the lake and having additional treatment to ensure that we're flowing clean water south instead of dumping it east and west. This project footprint may not seem that big. If you understand the scale, this is about 17,000 acres. You could fit Manhattan into that footprint. But when added to the additional areas of treatment we have south of Lake Okeechobee in both STAs and FEBs, it's an enormous network of treatment wetlands, the largest of its kind in the world. And again, it's to ensure that we're not sending that high phosphorus containing water both from the lake and running off of those sugar fields into the Everglades, where we know it has transformed habitat. And it's just an aerial showing the construction progress of that EA reservoir. Massive area, these large water control structures being built. This is an aerial I took of the hydration of that first cell of the new stormwater treatment area being built. And again, just seeing these large scale projects taking place before our eyes is a really heartening. These two shots I took of existing treatment wetlands south of Lake Okeechobee. And again, these are used to treat the polluted runoff from those sugar fields, but also to ensure that any additional water coming from the lake is clean and meeting that water quality standard for the Everglades. We've also built a reservoir and stormwater treatment area along the St. Lucie River, and it's been undergoing operational testing. They've identified some problems with water seeping out. That's being resolved. That project will help to improve the volume, timing, and quality of freshwater flows going to the St. Lucie. Again, trying to mitigate some of the harm. And it's not just the C44 reservoir on the East Coast. We have the C43 reservoir that's being built, this large geometric shape over here that's south of the Caloosahatchee River, the C43 canal. That project is roughly the same size as the storage reservoir being built south of the lake. It's about 10,000 acres in area. And again, we'll do the same thing for the Caloosahatchee that the C44 will do for the St. Lucie Estuary. Well, of course, our goal is to send water south. And to get water ultimately south into Everglades National Park, we need the conveyance capacity to do that, the plumbing. We have 3.3 miles of bridges that have been built. This allows, at present, water to flow freely into Everglades National Park as sheet flow for the first time in 100 years. And I was able to get up in a plane to view that from above. And this segment of bridging right here just shows that we're seeing increased hydration of wetlands downstream in Northeast Shark River Slough of Everglades National Park. And also from boat. Took our kayak out there a couple of years ago, and you can see looking back at the bridge. This is taken from Everglades National Park, and you can see that sheet flow extending through the pond apples out into the canal. Well, many people wonder, are the bridges working? We're not sending more flow south. Well, in fact, we are. We're redistributing the water crossing Tamiami Trail to where more flow can go under those bridges, where it was intended to go from the outset. And this is just a period of record showing water levels in Northeast Shark River Slough, and the wet areas are the wet season I've tried to identify in blue and the dry season in red. And you can see there's been an upward shift since those bridges have been constructed and since we've been allowed to flow more water into that part of Everglades National Park. It doesn't end here, because with the reservoir, we're actually going to get more water flowing south throughout the year. And to make this part of Tamiami Trail restoration ready, there's road works going on out there right now. This aerial just shows some of the vegetation clearing and demucking along Tamiami Trail. They're going to build a new elevated roadbed with small bridges that will allow us to ultimately raise water levels from a current constraint of 8.5 feet above sea level to 9.7. So not only will we see the benefits that I showed you in the graph of data previously, but this will allow us to raise water levels another 1.2 feet going into Everglades National Park. And the goal there is to get it across that finish line of Tamiami Trail, because that's really the point where the ecosystem becomes free flowing. But to ensure that we're not flooding those areas of Miami-Dade County that are immediately adjacent to Everglades National Park, we've employed this new cost-effective technology, and it's really an old technology. Trenchers aren't anything new, but this size of a trencher is certainly new and allows us to build underground walls, impenetrable seepage barriers that block the flow or the leakage of water out of the park into those adjacent communities. So, and we've lowered the cost by a factor of well, it's gone down about 2 orders of magnitude from the time that the comprehensive Everglades plan was passed. And so by ensuring flood protection, we're also maximizing restoration benefits because we're making these investments to put more water in the Everglades. This seepage control allows us to keep it in the Everglades. So it increases our efficiency with those restoration investments. And this is an area that's been problematic for decades. It's called the 8.5 square mile area, or the Las Palmas community in Miami-Dade County. And the reason why it's a problem is because it was built west of the tieback levee, which is the red line. The rest of Miami-Dade County, extending all the way over to Biscayne Bay, goes to the horizon. But this community sits behind this levee in yellow and the tieback levee. Well, with these seepage barriers now in place along the yellow line, we've been able to allow this area of Northeast Shark River Slough to become hydrated and not have any concern about flooding those communities, that community in the 8.5 square mile area. So it's the collection of the infrastructure in this area along Tamiami Trail, along the eastern boundary of Everglades National Park, that has really allowed us to realize substantial benefits into the park and ultimately down into Florida Bay. It starts in the freshwater marshes, though, of the park, because we've been able to increase the hydro period of these wetlands. That's important because that protects the habitat that depends on those peat soils that the Everglades produces over centuries to remain intact. And we know many areas, these peat soils are often too dry, those soils oxidize, and you lose elevation. By rehydrating these areas, we can jumpstart that peat soil building process and better protect those peat soils that we have remaining across the ecosystem that these habitats depend upon. The mix of tree islands, sawgrass ridges, and sloughs. This is not a flat wetlandscape. This is a corrugated landscape that depends on that variable soil building process and preservation of those soils to remain intact. And this is my gratuitous bird slide. I have to give credit to Max Stone, one of our board members, who's just an outstanding person and photographer. But the point of getting more water through these wetlands, preventing water from ponding, allowing the water to rise and fall more naturally, that provides the optimal conditions for the wading bird populations that the Everglades was once known for. And folks like Sabina and certainly Mark Cook could speak to much more eloquently, but we do keep an eye on the birds and certainly incorporate our understanding of them into the restoration planning and evaluation process. And then, of course, once that water makes its way down to the coast, it's going out Shark River into the Gulf of Mexico and the southwest coast, and it's coming out of Taylor Slough and Taylor River into the interior of Florida Bay. And this tannin-colored water just really illustrates the pulse of fresh water that we get at the beginning of the wet season each year. And it's really the combination of these two flow sources that drives the health of Florida Bay. because these two combined sources from Taylor Slough, which is a much lower volume of fresh water, but it freshens the interior of the bay, combined with Shark River Slough water, which really freshens coastal waters, and that water gets forced around Cape Sable into the western part of the bay through the tides. This helps to prevent hypersalinity from occurring in the interior of the bay, and reduced flows through Everglades National Park have resulted in pretty dramatic transformation in the seagrass and salinity conditions across Florida Bay. And it's really the drought years that are devastating, and that often results in seagrass die-off. This was a picture I took last year flying over snake bite, which is a major migratory bird and wading bird foraging area throughout much of the year, certainly in the winter months. And this area basically died back in 2015 as a result of the last seagrass die-off. And you can see that the tidal energy here in snakebite is still moving a lot of sediment, which means we don't have a lot of grass recovery yet. We're starting to see signs of grass recovery, but it's nowhere near what it was in 2012 and 13, 14 before the die-off. And so getting more fresh water down to this part of the ecosystem will not only prevent those kinds of die-off events from occurring, but it will also help to build resilience in times of extreme heat that we experienced this past summer, July 2023. And many of us expected that we would see another massive seagrass die-off event with the heat that we saw occurring last July. We didn't. And we think it's in large part due to the fact that not only did we get quite a bit of rainfall, but we're able to push much more water through the park now and get that water down into Florida Bay. And so salinity levels have been much improved this past year over previous years, and certainly in response to that extreme heat. So kind of the take-home message of all of this, back to resilience building, is that Everglades restoration, it doesn't just start with the infrastructure. That really helps to build capacity in terms of how we distribute water, how much water we can store. It's also about the treatment of that water, ensuring that it's clean. So infrastructure with added treatment gives us more capacity. And what that does is it allows for much more improved operations throughout the greater Everglades ecosystem, from the Kissimmee River to both the Caloosahatchee and St. Lucie rivers, all the way down to Florida Bay. And it's this sort of infrastructure, treatment, and operations collectively that serves as the basis for resilience building across South Florida. Lastly, Scott mentioned in the introduction on that slide there that my colleague and mentor, Tom Lodge, and I published the 5th edition of the Everglades Handbook this past year. And many of you might be familiar with one or all of the first 4 editions of the Everglades Handbook, but this has just been a great source of knowledge documenting the natural history of the ecosystem, as well as the importance of Everglades restoration. And I've been honored to be part of this process, and certainly this book moving forward. And I just wanted to put a plug in for that, because we've got a lot of updated information, not only the science, but also the progress that we've made in Everglades restoration. And I think I'll close it with that. So I'll stop sharing my screen now, Scott.
Okay. So thank you so much, Dr. Davis. That was brilliant. If you have questions for Dr. Davis, please put your questions in the chat. We are getting some of them already, and I know I have a couple. So I'm excited to ask them. We've also been joined by Natasha Warwick, who's who's our vice president, and who also spends a great deal of time in the Everglades and the STAs, because she also works for South Florida Water Management District. So she commented to me that she's been to all the areas that you've been describing.
Great.
So that's great. So she may chime in as well. So let me start with the questions. And by the way, I think your book, the Everglades Handbook, is available for download, isn't it?
I think it is available as an ebook. Yes.
Okay, so we're going to try to, Mary's going to try to, my wife's Mary's going to try to find that, and we're going to try to put that in the chat. So people are interested, they can go ahead and download that. Let me go to the questions. So let me start with a tough one. Do sugar growers contribute to cleaning their runoff? Are there fines that they contribute?
Well, the short answer to that is they contribute. If you add up all of the capital costs and operations of that water treatment infrastructure, it adds up to about 11% of the total costs. And we're talking a $3+ billion infrastructure and tens of millions to operate it each and every year. So that just kind of puts into perspective their contribution. The rest has been paid for by taxpayers, property owners across South Florida.
So I can ask a follow-up question to that? So their contribution, is that from taxes on their property, or is that is there another mechanism by which they contribute?
I would defer to my colleague, chief economist at the Everglades Foundation on that, but they pay into an agricultural privilege tax that's a per acre tax. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. All right, next question. By the way, are they fined if they don't? Are they fined if they don't contribute? Are there any fines for pollution or?
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
It's a tax, so yeah.
Okay.
The Water Management District collects that revenue. They would have those records. Yeah.
So another question is by Paige Huffy. Who will monitor and maintain the operation? So who monitors and maintains the operations that are taking place in the Everglades?
It's largely the South Florida Water Management District. They have a sort of a centralized water control room that they keep track on many of the structures. But the Army Corps of Engineers, they certainly play a role as well, particularly around Lake Okeechobee and along the St. Lucie and Caloosahatchee rivers. They manage primarily those structures, but they work together on operations and operational planning as well as restoration planning.
Okay. I have a question from Paul Davis. Steve, great overview of a very complex system. I agree, great overview. You stated that LOSUM would reduce flow to the LWL. It was my understanding that it would actually increase the potential discharge to LWL. Also, could you mention that LWL projects were in the draft CERP plan, but not in the final plan? Palm Beach County tried hard to get it included. By the way, the LWL is the Lake Worth Lagoon. This was a lost opportunity that should be reversed, perhaps via adaptive management.
Well, that's a lot there.
I know, sorry.
The first part with the LOSUM plan, it will reduce discharges to Lake Worth Lagoon. The flows from the lake to the lagoon are it's a little more complicated to quantify than what goes to the St. Lucie or Caloosahatchee. Obviously, the gates that open to the C43 and C44, it's very easy to quantify that and track what goes downstream. It's a little more complicated going to Lake Worth Lagoon. But at the same time, the releases that pass through those structures into the lagoon, it's a much lower volume. And the plan does call for a substantial reduction as an annual average to that system. As far as the projects that were to be included and then were excluded from the plan, I'm not familiar with those.
Do you know if there's going to be any adaptive management to perhaps include that more in the plan, or?
Well, I don't think that there are going to be new elements included to the comprehensive plan, because each plan that is developed now, they're pulling the original components out of the plan and adapting those. They're not adding, they're just adapting existing components.
Okay. Kathy Ombach asks, how long does it take to the grasses to grow back to reduce the silt runoff that you showed in the snake bite slide?
That 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 part of the system is really challenging. Florida Bay as a whole is challenging because it's not a single bay. It's actually a series of smaller bays or basins that respond differently at different points of the year and certainly to different types of drought conditions. Snake bite is an area that is exposed to relatively strong tidal energy. And when you remove the grasses, that sediment gets suspended and mobilized readily. And so that in itself slows the recovery process. Some of the areas recovered very quickly in terms of seagrass regeneration. But what we found following die-off in the late 1980s is that it took a couple of decades to get the seagrass community back to what it was prior to die-off. So getting seagrass reestablished, that's the primary goal, and we haven't seen it completely in snakebite, but we know that it takes a decade or more. That's why we're hoping that system doesn't get knocked back again. The Caloosahatchee and the St. Lucie, they're a little bit different because they are more open and exchanging with tidal waters. The seagrasses in those systems recover over much shorter intervals, maybe 2 to 3 years. The problem is with those systems, they've been getting hammered with discharges nearly every other year. So the recovery time isn't enough before the return interval of the discharges. So it's really, again, about having the infrastructure that restoration provides will buy these systems more time to recover from those types of disturbances.
Thank you for elaborating so clearly about that. And I didn't know, and I don't know if all our viewers knew about Florida Bay being a series of bay. I've been seeing lots of presentations about the bay, and no one's ever mentioned that. So thank you for sharing that. Chuck Hignott asks, when will all level roads to A1A FEB be open to the public? Will it be before the EAA project completion?
The A1 FEB, that is currently operational. That is the feature along US 27. In terms of access roads, I can't speak to that. I know that some of that is being utilized for access to the construction site for the EA reservoir that's further west. But I'm not sure I understand the question, and I don't think I can speak to that.
I think the question pertains to people who want to be able to go, because the FEB A1A has become a prominent birding area. And so people are very excited about being in there. And so I think it's a question about access.
Scott, I can answer that question.
Natasha, go for it.
Yeah, sorry, Steve. Yeah, so the levee roads will be closed. The ones that are currently closed will be closed for the duration of the EAA construction.
Okay.
But the rest, the A1 FEB is open still.
Okay, sorry, Chuck. So I guess you're limited to what roads are already.
Thank you for the lifeline there.
Yes. Thank you, Natasha. So Ruth Perlow asked, will there be a new highway that DeSantis is in favor of in the Everglades north to south?
I don't know. I know there was talk of new roads further west. You know, these things, they don't necessarily die, they just go into a stasis. So I expect something like that will come back up, you know, this year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. We're obviously a growing state, whether we like it or not. And I think the issue of transit's always going to be there. You know, if you ask my opinion, we should look at things other than roads, but that's just my personal opinion.
Yeah, I had a feeling you would say that, and I agree. So Kevin Baker asks, the Luxatch River had dry season days with a few violations of the minimum low flow level. Any movement on reservoirs to get the river a bit more dry season clean water?
I'm sorry, what river was that?
So this is the Loxahatchee River, which is up by, up a little further north.
Yes, in fact, the Loxahatchee River Watershed Restoration Project has been authorized, and it's in that list of projects in that integrated delivery schedule. I can't speak to the timeline for that, but there are a number of water preserve areas, water storage areas that will really help to improve the quality and the quantity and timing of flows going into that estuarine system, which we know has been impacted for decades.
So basically, it is in the works, Kevin.
It is in the works.
Deborah Kerr asks, an informative update to CERP. Thank you so much. Janice McFadden says, excellent presentation of a very complicated project. Thanks. Yes. Hillary Pinair, thank you. AE and Dr. Davis, great presentations. Janine LaRochelle says, really enjoyed this presentation. Thank you. Lillian Manichakolko says, great info. Thank you. Carrie Freeman, thank you for this informative update and for the very useful illustrations and visuals. Mickey Marshall, excellent presentation. It gives me hope. That's good. We all need hope. Thank you. Nancy Noyes Stephen, thank you for a wonderful presentation. So that's the questions from our audience so far. I have a question. I didn't realize that that there was so much current phosphorus pollution still in the Everglades. And you mentioned that early in your presentation. Is that legacy pollution? Because I know that the STAs supposedly are delivering, 9 to 10 parts per billion phosphorus level, supposedly. So
Well,
is it legacy?
not quite yet. Some of them are performing just superbly. In fact, the A1 flow equalization basin has really been helpful in achieving the water quality goal through the central part of the EAA. There's the STA 5.6 to the west. It's got some problems that the Water Management District's been working to address. And then we also have some issues still with STA 1 East and 1 West. We're not quite hitting the marks to the east and west, and the district's working pretty intensively to achieve that water quality goal before we get to the first sort of year of compliance, which we'll know a lot more once we get into the middle of 2027. But it's we do have areas of legacy pollution within the Everglades, and we see that by the fact that there's dense monospecific stands of cattail across upper 2A around Water Conservation Area 1. But once you get beyond those walls of cattail, and there's also substantial cattail coming out of the Western Everglades into Water Conservation Area 3A, that the Western Everglades Restoration Project will help to address. Finally, that project we hope to get authorized this year, 2024. And so collectively, those projects are improving water quality across the water conservation areas. And we're seeing some sites, long-term monitoring sites, transition from polluted to looking more and more natural. The problem is there's still a lot of phosphorus in the soil of those cattail-dominated areas that will continue to be a problem. But we've got to control it at the source before we can tackle any of those problems within the system. And, that's another area where the Water Management District scientists have been looking at potential solutions for transforming some of those degraded cattail areas into more natural functioning Everglades wetland.
Speaking of legacy phosphorus, kind of the elephant in the equation here, of course, is Lake Okeechobee, which has enormous legacy pollution in it. So How is that going? How does that fit into the equation? I know, of course, the discharges from Lake Okeechobee are impacting both coasts whenever they have to discharge. But what about that legacy pollution and its effect on discharges going to the Everglades? Is everything cleaned prior?
Well, we don't have a solution for the lake, and it's not just the lake. It's the watershed of the lake also. And when people talk about legacy phosphorus, they generally think about just what's sitting in the bottom of that shallow lake. But there's also a legacy of phosphorus pollution in that 4,000 square mile watershed north of the lake, that even if we removed all the cattle, even if we removed all the agriculture, there's a legacy of phosphorus pollution that will continue to be washed south into ultimately the Kissimmee River and into the lake. And so the solution that we've called for, that the district is moving forward incrementally with, is the need for more treatment, but north of the lake. We need the same kinds of treatment wetlands north of the lake to help catch and sequester that phosphorus before it goes into the lake. Got to do that before you can begin to think about solving that legacy problem within the lake that is kind of mind-boggling in itself. And that doesn't mean you just throw up your arms and say, well, we can't do anything. No, the solution is Everglades restoration in the interim, to flow that water south, because we know we have to clean it. And we have the network of treatment wetlands south of the lake to ensure that that phosphorus is stripped out of that water down to a standard that's protective of the Everglades. And so that's really the solution to this problem until we can finally resolve the water quality issues that the lake has. And that might take technological innovation. As of yet, we don't have solutions other than just going in and dredging the lake out, which is kind of harmful in itself, not to mention incredibly costly. So the state has been trying out different technologies over the years, and we're seeing an advancement in some of those technologies, not only in their ability to remove phosphorus, but also their ability to do it more cost effectively and their ability to do it with much larger volumes. And so that once we get to that point where we're talking about ability to cost effectively treat millions of gallons per day, then we can begin to think about what to do with the lake.
Wow. Sounds like an enormously complex situation. And I'm so grateful that you're there, Steve, to kind of enlighten us and enlighten our elected officials, and I'm sure members of the Southwater Water Management District community on some of these issues as well. We have one more kind of thank you. Valerie Terry Ellis says, thank you so much to Everglades, Audubon Everglades, for hosting this webinar, and to Steve Davis for a visually powerful explanation of where we're at in Everglades restoration. Thank you for the aerial photos and graphics. Yes, excellent presentation. So I have no more questions, Steve, and there's no more questions from our audience. So thank you so much for an enlightening presentation. And you have definitely conveyed to us the enormity of the situation, but I feel as our previous person who mentioned in the chat, there is hope. It seems like there is hope, and I'm grateful for that, because we all know how important the Everglades are.
We're making great progress, and I have much more optimism and hope now than I did 10, 20 years ago.
That's great. That's great. Well, thank you so much again, and have a great evening.
Thank you all.
Okay, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And thank you to our great team who helps put this presentation together. From left to right, that's Amaline Cook, who you will be seeing again with her 1 or 2 minute short presentations. Mark Slifkin, who helps behind the scenes, and I couldn't do this without him. Thank you, Mark, so much. Autumn Quixote, who was with us tonight, but who has in the past helped to introduce and do question Q&As. And again, Natasha Warwick, who actually was going to handle the introduction and Q&A today, but had an appointment she had to keep. But her knowledge, of course, showed when she chimed in on the Everglades. Mary Young, my wife, who helps me behind the scenes, who puts in all those things into the chat. Cherish Cook, who helps with the graphics. And of course, Sabina Veg, who really puts these great presentations together for me and leads our programs teams. We could not do these virtual presentations without this group. And we can't wait to see you on September 3rd while we take a break to plan next year's programming. So please join us again in September for our next presentation. And we can't wait to see you then. Have a wonderful summer. Be sure to get some photos and perhaps join our photo group session for our share. And join us for our next meeting and tell us about your summer, because we can't wait to hear about it. That's all I have. So have a wonderful evening and take care. Bye-bye.